when and where you were born?
I was born in Springfield, Massachusetts on the 24th of January in 1917 in the middle of the biggest blizzard New England had that winter. And I almost didn't make it to the hospital. And that was my home until I went to college. And I went to college at Massachusetts State College, now called the University of Massachusetts. I graduated from there in 1941, and in my diploma, rolled up with my diploma, were my orders to active duty in the U.S. Cavalry. Look, push the stem of that thing and get a light. Just push it down. That's it.
There we go. Let's see. And we know that you had an interest in, I'm just curious about some of your other interests. I know that you were an English major, and we also know a little bit about your musical past. Anything else? Were you into sports at all?
Well, first of all, in order to get through college, in the Depression era, my father gave me $50 when he left me at college the first day and said, if you ever need any more, come back. I never had to come back because I worked my way through college, literally. So when you do that, I played with the varsity team on the first game I ever went to with the team. And after that game, I found out I could have a job.
What sport?
As a football. And I found out that I could have a job, and as a function of the job, my food would be free, the cost of food, which in those days was a good part of going to college. So I accepted the job and dropped the team. And now I played on a golf team at high school, and I could play tennis pretty well. I was born where there were 35 tennis courts. I was born in a big park, by the way, which is quite a way to grow up when you're a city boy. You grow in an area of ground about 900 acres with tennis courts, baseball diamonds, skating. Quite a place. But my college was affected by the fact that I had to work to get through school. And I was very fortunate because in addition to the work in the cafeteria where I worked, I was paid fairly well considering those days because I was working as a professional singer. And I kept up the traveling and the singing with the orchestras during that time.
All right.
So.
No.
Okay.
Go.
We were just talking about Oliver Stone's movie when we left, and one question I got, is there anything you don't like about the movie, the way it turned out?
Well, I could hardly answer that question very well because I see so few movies, I can't say, well, I like this one better. I remember I saw Ben-Hur, something with Raymond Navarro in about 1929. I'm not an expert.
Prouty, regarding Oliver Stone's film JFK, was there anything about the film you didn't like?
Some things that bothered me,
Yeah,
because
factual.
as an advisor I had tried to keep inappropriate ideas out of the film, but I'm afraid there were some people that wanted those ideas in because they kept cropping up. I looked at 7 of the script while it was being prepared, doing the best I could to recommend to stay with the facts. Now, on the other hand, I should say the powerful things about it, the things that Stone and I agreed with very much were that the film should present a level playing field for all the people that saw it. In other words, explain all the assassination lore, good and the bad. Let the public get it all at once. Then come into the Garrison trial, the only place where there is an official record of certain elements of the... Now, I had worked with Garrison on his manuscript for his book, so I was very familiar with what he was doing. In fact, I made inputs to it through a series of letters that I wrote to Garrison, which became the transcript of the Man X Garrison conversation at the end of the film. They were using letters I had written Garrison, so our conversation actually, although it was, you might say, just created there, it came from the words of my letters. So what the Garrison part of it did was show what the court would work on if they had a chance at it. See, Texas never permitted a trial, which is functionally illegal. And then, in the end, I told Stone, I said, look, the film has to come to Washington. You've got to have Washington in the movie. And so we had that part in it. Well, in doing that, I think that I was able, with Stone's skills and ability, to put together a film that gave the public the story, then gave them the details, in fact, the way the Garrison trial set them, despite the fact that so many people have attacked Garrison for what he tried to do. And then we brought it to the end when we said, look, the important thing about Kennedy's assassination is not Lee Harvey Oswald or Ruby and all that foolishness, the Warren Commission. It's why was the president killed? And I remember when I saw the first showing of the film up on Capitol Hill, the audience just kind of went like that. It finally got to them. That's what's important. Well, now, if anything could be attributed to my collaboration with Stone, it was that area there. We were trying to open the eyes, and we said, we've told you all this, we've seen what a trial tried to do, now let's think about some of the real things. Why was he killed? And the film was pretty good about that. There were things in it I'd like to have seen come out, but it's like the newspaper. You buy the whole newspaper to get the columns you like. You have to accept the rest of it.
So there's nothing really big that bothered you thought that was going to be really...
If we could do it over again, I think I would have tried to clarify Kennedy's role in the Bay of Pigs, because that's been terribly slaughtered by the so-called historians and newsmen since that era. But it wasn't the real subject, and I didn't fight hard enough for it.
At that time, when the Warren Commission report came out, you obviously knew a lot more about it than most. And how did you feel about that report when it came out? You know, how did how inside? How did you feel, and how did you present yourself, publicly with regard to that?
Well, that's a very good point you're making. And I'll tell you right now, I have never even touched the Warren report, let alone read it. I have a small version of it that the New York Times put out, I think it was, that I use for reference. That's, what happened on what date or what hour and so on. And I've read some of the books, but the Warren report is absolutely fabricated. What got me was that even when I was in Christchurch, New Zealand, where I was when I heard about the murder, and I bought the first paper on the street, and I was with a U.S. congressman who was traveling with me. I was on military orders and he was on congressional orders. And I looked at the paper, and here's the picture of this school book depository building. And my word, they allege the shots came from that building, and here were windows open. And I turned to the congressman and I said, listen, Pete, something is terribly wrong in Dallas. If our presidential protection, the military units were there, they wouldn't have had one window open. It would have all been closed, would have been covered by snipers. Something's wrong. And well, from that moment on, and then when I got back to my office in the Pentagon, I got hold of all the paper, we had, everything in there, and I went over to the Library of Congress, and I just confirmed what I believed, that the whole thing was a very high-powered, professional hit job, the same as the mafia would use, or the same as governments and assassinations would use. There's no question about it. So I never believed the Warren Commission at all. I took it for exactly what it was, a cover story to mislead the people of the world. And it's been pretty effective. They've kept that cover story alive for 32 years now.
I have a question that you're mentioning. You might have wished Kennedy's role in the Bay of Pigs would have been articulated a little more deeply. And one of the questions I'd written was, do you know the reason why McGeorge Bundy called General Cabell to cancel the Bay of Pigs airstrike?
Not the reason why, although there's clues to it here and there. I would say that the first time I ever heard that, and my knowledge of Bundy, I never met him, I worked with his brother. His brother was in the Pentagon, but I didn't happen to work with him at all, was his inexperience with military operations. I don't think he realized that Castro's 3 jets were just like having 3,000, as long as the only planes against them were prop driven. See, they could go so much faster and had so much firepower that we had given the exiles, the people that invaded, the Cubans, the biggest air force in Latin America. They had more firepower than any air force in Latin America, but they could not fight jets. So they had to destroy the jets. Now, if you look at the 100-page report of the Cuban study group that Kennedy had appointed right after the failure of the Bay of Pigs. And that study group is really a work of art. It was Maxwell Taylor, who had been Chief of Staff of the Army, and he was the military advisor to the President. Arleigh Burke was the Chief of Naval Operations and the top military man closest to the Bay of Pigs operation, because it was going to be a landing operation, which is Marine, and he's in charge of Marines. Then the next one was Allen Dulles was on the committee, which is very important, and Bobby Kennedy. Their meeting room was only a few doors down the hall in a JCS area from mine. Friends of mine who were going in to talk to them used to come in the office, have a cup of coffee till they were called to go in. And when they'd come out, they'd say, you know, that's an interesting group in here. Just think, Allen Dulles, Arleigh Burke, and Maxwell Taylor. But over in the corner, quietly on a little straight back chair, the Bobby Kennedy. And he listens to every word. And the minute the meeting's over, he jumps in a car, goes to the White House, and Kennedy, President Kennedy, has a meeting. He said there's no way that that study group could have accepted things that weren't true or tried to coin something in their report for the benefit of the public. It was a true report. Well, why reporters don't read that thing before they write the garbage they're writing about the Bay of Pigs, I can't believe. I've got a copy of it. I've got a copy of the original. It was printed on, remember when we used to say they mimeograph copies, big long sheets of paper. And it says exactly what I think was the truth, that McGeorge Bundy called Cabell to say, don't bother having those planes hit the jets at the time of the landing. Wait until the planes can operate off the runway on the beach, and there was a runway on the beach, and then we can say there were Cuban planes firing on the Cubans, not what would be apparent with that American-supported plane. He said that would destroy all our cover story. Well, he just didn't understand how essential it was to destroy those planes. And General Cabell made a huge mistake by not calling off the landing, because Kennedy had ordered those planes to be destroyed, and the JCS had said if the planes and the ships, the Cuban ships, are not destroyed first, the landing won't succeed. They already knew that.
Does that fit in at all with Adlai Stevenson's episode where he was embarrassed, where he said these are Cuban planes, and the Cuban ambassador holds up the picture and says these are loaded with these guns, we don't have any of these? Well,
what most of the writers fail to do is they don't quote the document that is in charge of covert operations, and that is a document issued by the National Security Council called 5412. It was issued at Eisenhower's time in March of 1954. It says that any covert operation involving U.S. must be plausibly deniable. And if it isn't, you don't do it. Well, if you can't plausibly deny the airplanes that go bombing the coast of Cuba, you shouldn't do it, see? Well, on the first attack on Cuba, a few planes attacked and destroyed all but the 3 of the planes Castro had. That was the day before, on Saturday. And then 1 or 2 of the planes, to make their cover story, landed in the United States, one at Miami. And they took a picture of this plane with the Cuban pilot, and on the plane was marked in the Cuban insignia, everything. It was all done up for the story. And the picture was on the front page of the New York Times. Well, Adlai Stevenson was in the UN building when everybody started howling about this, especially the Cubans, saying that the U.S. was involved. And Stevenson held the New York Times up for the photographers and said, look, this plane is a Cuban plane, and the Cubans did have B-26s. And he said, their men defected, and they're the ones that were doing this shooting, not anything to connect with the United States. And then the Cuban very wisely got up and he said, take a careful look at that picture. See the 8 guns coming out of the nose? Castro has no plane like that. See, they used the planes we had given them for that attack, which was stupid. And they should have taken the guns out of the nose. And Stevenson was so embarrassed that he must have, and this is conjecture on my part, he must have called McGeorge Bundy and said, look, that can't happen again. We don't have any more B-26s with 8 guns in the nose. until we can do it from the beach, then it's clear. So he was thinking only of the plausible denial
Right.
part. He didn't go far enough to say, look, we've got to win this one no matter what the hell happens. And that's what the president had done. The president said, we're going to wipe out those planes. And Kennedy knew about that NSC directive. He was a member of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate in those days. He knew it very well. So you see, it's the way people have been writing about it that makes it look wrong. And you can almost make a case for McGeorge Bundy making the phone call, because he had been jumped on by Stevenson, and he knew the NSC 5412, and he wasn't real sharp about the airplanes. He wasn't in on the group that kept meeting with Arleigh Burke and the others and the JCS. Then the fact, if the planes aren't destroyed, don't go. So he made the phone call. But Cabell was, and Cabell should have said, okay, we won't fly the mission, but we won't land on the beach either. There was still time, 9:30 in the morning, the boats hadn't even started moving to the beach. It's a very hard thing to define when most of the writing had been done by people that don't know what they're talking about.
The reason I wanted to focus in on that is because it was only over the last couple of days that I became aware of some of those details. And until the last couple of days, I thought there was a far more sinister reason for that airstrike being canceled. And now it sounds like it was more,
But it is strange that Alan Dulles was out of the country.
Well, you're right. See, there's too many factors in there to brush these things aside. And I have to sort of make a case for Bundy in order to put it through, but I think I know that was my first thought. I thought, and I was right there on active duty in those days, and I thought, the son of a gun must not have understood us. And then I realized that he wasn't at some of these meetings, and he might not have read the papers, all that stuff. And since the thing, people have tried to blow that all up out of shape and put it as simply, Kennedy said, don't go after those planes. Well, where that's false is, you see, if anybody in that Cuban study group had brought that idea, that it was the president that said cancel the flight, Bobby was right there and would have neutralized him in 2 seconds. You see, that was where Kennedy really pulled a masterful deal by putting that group together. In fact, my friends that used to come from the meetings would come back and say, there's 4 scorpions in a bottle there, none of them coming out alive. That was a real group, And really it was, when you figure the different personalities of the people involved. But it was Bobby Kennedy reporting to his brother every day what went on that kept that from, nobody that I know of has had the temerity to say that it was Kennedy that canceled the flight. I mean, no important writer, because he couldn't have possibly done it. But what everybody should do, what the writers should do, is read that report, which is available, written by General Maxwell Taylor. It was a report of this 4-man group, and it was unanimously approved. So there, it's the word, and I have it right upstairs, and I've been quoting from it for you.
Yeah.
You write about it in some detail in this book, and you get to the part where it says that McGeorge Bundy called General Cabell to cancel, and then I believe, if I remember correctly, say they leave it at that, and that's why the question to my mind popped up. Why doesn't it go further? And
I think the sinister thought was meant to fail.
Right, and that I wanted to get at some point into some questions about your concept
I think you'll
of the high
recall in the
cabal.
book, I also pointed out that Bundy, years later, wrote an op-ed column for the New York Times that said, the brigade's my fault. I think it's in the book.
I don't remember that.
Well, if it isn't, it's in articles I've written since. But you can get the New York Times on a certain date and read, as though Bundy was sort of admitting, there's some things I just didn't know. And looking back, like a lot of people in their jobs, why did so-and-so fail in this job? Why did this? And he said, the brigade's my fault. Now, that's pretty clear when you see it in the op-ed column of the New York Times.
Unless you're ready, I have a couple of questions about the concept of the high cabal. And when we're talking about sinister versus bad planning or whatever, I wanted to know if you could give a couple of other examples that to you imply the existence of a high cabal of world events with maybe a little bit of information. Just speak to that subject. I know you've talked about the oil embargo, and I was just wondering if there are other things that happen.
Well, you know, I took the words high cabal from Churchill.
Right.
And the Churchill source is one of his close friends, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he was the comparable to our Chief Justice Supreme Court. And he said that during the war, while Churchill was down in the bunker below number 10 Downing Street, they were talking about air raid and all that, and Churchill would freely mention the high cabal. You know, so if he wasn't the high cabal, you know, well, but that's an old expression, and as you read Buckminster Fuller, you see that he says that the Chinese, way back in their culture, have always had what they call the gentry, that they knew was above everything else, and so on. But I can tell you a personal case, and I forget whether it's in the book or not, that I was with Allen Dulles in John Foster Dulles' home. We had gone there together, and the Secretary of Defense was there. Now, those are three pretty prominent people, I would say, in this government. And after a discussion that involved preparation to call President Eisenhower with the answer to the problem they'd had, and they were quite concerned about having to do that, John Foster Dulles got up from the chair he was in and went to a set of bookshelves and took a ordinary white telephone down. It had no dial system of any kind on it or touchtone, and somebody answered immediately, a operator, and he said, "I want Mr. Ostrakovich," you know, some Russian name, obviously, and he was speaking openly with the group that was there. And he said, "I think he is in Moscow, although he may be traveling," a little thing like that. So we knew he was talking to some important person in Russia. That was not a political name that I'd ever heard, and it seemed as though it didn't affect the others that way. After discussing our problem for a few minutes, he turned to me and he said, "We can get the crew out that has been captured by the Soviets in 10 days. This man will set it up for us. Can you have an airplane at such and such a place in 10 days? I said, "Yes, sir, I can." He talked to the man a little longer and he said, "We'll be in this place in 10 days and pick the crew up." Well, now, it was clear to me that he was talking to somebody high enough up to tell the Russian government that that was going to be done. At the same time, the Russians were having open press conferences telling the press of the world that this airplane had crossed the border of the Soviet Union, that they had shot it down, the crew had lived, and that they had the 10 men at hand. See, and they were going to have to reverse that policy and say they'd released the men because they found out it wasn't intentional or something like that. Well, now that couldn't have been done in a political situation. They'd have had to have a couple of meetings for months, you know, and that kind of thing, typical deal. That decision happened just like that. I had a plane there in 10 days. We got the 10 men out, and that ended the case. That was the time when the Russians shot down Allen Dulles' personal VIP plane because he wasn't using it. He had loaned it to the men in the U-2 program, and they were going to Pakistan for U-2 matters. And a real goof on the part of the agency and a horrible international situation, but because of the pressure of the man that John Foster Dulles called, they could reverse that. And I've never seen anything like that in diplomatic channels, except probably the fact that since the Tehran conference, they've concealed the fact that the Chinese were there. And I personally flew T.V. Soong's delegates there, and T.V. Soong at that time, you know, his sister was Chiang Kai-shek's wife, and he was the wealthiest man in the world. In other words, one of the most powerful men in the world. His delegates were there. Well, they conceal that also. Well, in order to conceal things with Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek at the same meeting, there must be a terrific power group above them to say, "Hey, fellas, you can talk all you want, but you're not going to mention it." See, you can't do that if you're not up pretty high. And I just can't conceive, at this day and age, that most people don't realize that there is a power higher than, and I'm not just talking about Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. They all work for somebody. They're all working men. This is a higher.
Would a guy like T.V. Soong be a member of the power?
Yes, I think he's the only one I could, with some assurance in my own experiences, say that he would have to be included in that.
And perhaps...
In other words, he's an anonymous person with respect to government, but powerful enough to influence four governments in the middle of the biggest war we ever had.
And perhaps his presence there might have been the reason to shield the presence of the Chinese.
Well, yes, they just, I don't know any history book. I taught at Yale for years after World War II ended, for the next 4 years, 3 years. And I was there with one of the best libraries in the world, the Yale Library, and I never found anything. I was teaching a course called Evolution of Warfare. I wanted to answer that question. I never found anything that mentioned the Russians until several years later. I'm a member of the Society of Historians for American Foreign Relations. I got a clue about a record of the Tehran Conference published by the U.S. government, but not in a book about the Tehran Conference. It's just a note in another book, and it's the only printed proof that I have, other than my own personal proof. I was there at Tehran. Not at the conference, but I was there.
Right. You mentioned in JFK, the closest American equivalent that you can think of would be someone like Averell Harriman, except that he had an ostentatious public persona.
What disqualifies him is his popularity. I think one of the greatest strengths of the people in the high Kabbalah that they have been trained, most likely for generations, to be absolutely anonymous. If the guy is not anonymous, he's not on it, by definition. Because with that kind of responsibility, you wouldn't be on something like that. And Harriman was, just like Nelson Rockefeller, just much too popular to be.
Would people like John Foster Dulles or Allen Dulles, as they are making, a call like the one that you talked about, do they know who it is that they're talking to?
Oh yes, have to know. It was clear before we made the call that they had discussed it rather openly, who they were going to call and why and what they were going to say and all that. And see, they were asking the Russian government to change something that they were right in the process then of doing. The news releases have been going out for 18 hours before we even found that a U.S. airplane had been lost. We didn't even know the plane was lost. The reason was it was Dulles' plane and it wasn't on the records. And I had to find it by calling a fellow that I knew might have seen it recently, and he said, yeah, he said, the U-2 guys are going to Pakistan. And I said, boy, get after that, because they didn't get to Pakistan. But it's clear that they knew the man they called, and they knew what he could do for them. See, well, that's like a lawyer. If you ask a lawyer who's his sponsor, he may tell you and he may not tell you.
Is there impression they were asking, or were they telling?
When they called?
Yeah.
They were definitely asking, because they had to talk. They had spent quite a bit of time talking about how impossible it was going to be for them to explain how it happened to be Allen Dulles' airplane that was shot down without him knowing it, and tell Eisenhower that. So they had to be able to reverse all this stuff and say, look, the Russians realized it was just a mistake. It wasn't an offensive operation. We weren't spying on anybody, all that sort of stuff. And then after that, they went ahead and made the call and said, look, we've got to do this. We can't take the flare-up.
So maybe in that high talk, they would owe him a favor.
Yeah, oh, sure.
Yeah.
Of course they would. Yeah.
On May the 1st, 1960, a U-2 unarmed reconnaissance plane took off to fly a spy mission over the Soviet Union. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers, who was employed by the CIA and was claimed to have been shot down by the Soviet military at 70,000 feet, approximately 1,200 miles inside the Soviet Union. In the following days, Nikita Khrushchev exploited the U.S. government's cover story and walked out of the summit meeting in Paris on May 16, 1960. There is a direct relationship between the U-2 incident and the end of U.S. President Eisenhower's crusade for peace. In response to Khrushchev, the U.S. Department of State issued a statement on May 7, 1960 that, insofar as the authorities in Washington are concerned, there was no authorization for any such flight as described by Mr. Khrushchev. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty worked in the Pentagon at that time, and he has a very interesting recollection of this event. What follows are 4 separate interviews regarding Gary Powers' U-2 flight.
It said that the U-2 flights over Russia, the Americans shared the information with the British freely, and in return, the British supplied pilots. I saw a picture, it looked like 10, 15 guys, and evidently they were U-2 pilots, and it claimed that these guys were British.
Well, the British had U-2s.
Oh, their own U-2s?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
The U-2 wasn't a CIA thing. They couldn't maintain airplanes. SAC maintained the Air Force. The U-2 selected the targets and the time of going and that sort of thing. But the planes were supported by the military. They were purchased by the military. I made one of the original phone calls simply as a function of my office. The system I had furnished supplies for them all to their operation, and it was a professional flight operation, which the CIA was authorized to use for spying purposes. The secret of the U-2 was the camera. Geez, the camera was so advanced that's the U-2 that went down, the Powers on it, didn't have the U-2 camera. It had an ordinary old bomber camera.
Oh,
In
really?
other words, somebody ahead of time selectively had taken the Lundahl out and let I even have somewhere the serial number, the one that was on the U-2 that went down, and it wasn't a Lundahl. And
That's another telling.
In other words, they were trying so hard to keep the Lundahl out of the Soviets' hands that.
But they knew that
flight-
plane was going down.
Yeah. Well, that plane had crashed previously. It was landing in Japan and run short of fuel at the base where Oswald was working. At the time he was working there.
At Sugi.
And it bellied in, which didn't hurt it. It lands on the belly anyway. It's got a little tiny wheel underneath, but no other wheels. And they brought it to Lockheed, and the Lockheed people rebuilt it. And in the process, it appears, put a different camera in it and maybe some other things to protect secrets. And then that's the plane that flew over the Soviet Union, which is kind of an interesting story.
So to get back to this, the British were able to use those planes, or they bought their own?
I don't know whether they bought them or whether they were
Just leased
made
for the
available.
job, yeah.
It's just like I was telling you about the Norwegian operation we had, where the planes are based in Norway, but we used non-American pilots a good bit of the time to fly them over the Soviet Union regularly. It's a way clandestine work is done so that it isn't attributable, but of course there's no way you can deny where a U-2 comes from. See, it's got to be an American airplane.
But in that case, Gary Powers was in a uniform, or a jumpsuit.
Well,
Information with him?
You know, you did the famous pictures of taken of everything he had in his pockets when he went down. Well, the U-2 pilots didn't have any pockets, for one thing. I mean, you're not going to have a guy that's supposed to be a spy and then equip him with everything else, you know, his club card and his automobile license and all that. And plus the trinkets he was supposed to hand out to bribe people to take care of him, and a flag that's saying, I'm a U.S. citizen, I need your help, and, you know, an escape and evasion kit. Well, that's ridiculous. Well, Powers didn't know that was on the plane. The parachute has 2 seats. When you sit on it, one is your parachute. It was in between the 2 seats. Somebody had put his stuff there. They took it from him and said, you're going on a flight. They put it. So when he landed, the Russians found it, and they said, here's what he had with him. What do you mean, tell us he's not an American military pilot? Well, that stuff is contrived. But the facts that came out later prove the whole darn thing was set up that way. He was surprised to find out what they claimed he had on board.
In the facts, I'm not familiar with them. Did he crash land, or did he actually just land?
Well, the distinction in the U-2 is not very great.
Okay.
If you got a runway, it's not a crash. If it's in a field, it is a crash. The underneath of a U-2 has just a small single wheel, and because it's made as light as it can be. In fact, all the pilots called it a glider. And the wreckage that they showed was sent to Kelly Johnson at Lockheed, and he said that wreckage never came from one of our airplanes. It's just some junk they had in Moscow, and took a picture of it.
Oh, really?
You know, the picture of the wreckage of U-2 is not the
Yeah.
U-2.
Because they did show big pictures of the cabin and that, right?
Yeah.
But I didn't realize that was not
they
the...
had the plane. And another thing was that in one of the pictures, the U-2 is shown, and the canopy, the big plastic canopy over the top of the pilot, is laying on the ground, unbroken, not broken. But you couldn't take, it'd be like dropping a glass from 100 feet up, and it didn't break. I mean, they contrived the Russians were trying to get, trying to prove to the world that they could bring a plane down from 80 or 90,000 feet. And see, that's why they built the plane. They knew at Lockheed that nothing the Russians had could reach the altitude the operating altitude of the airplane. Therefore, it couldn't be brought down. So when the Russians said they did bring it down, the first thing Dulles said to the Fulbright Committee was they couldn't have reached it at its operating altitude. It came down lower and then they got it. Well, it got it means they put MiGs around it, flying with it. Somebody said that there was a reporter over there who was riding on a train or something like that. We wrote a story about the sky was full of MiGs. But
so they just forced him down.
Yeah, that's when he was down low altitude. Well, and of course, his engine wasn't running. His engine had conked out. See, the U-2 had to have special fuel.
Hydrogen.
And the special fuel was combined. The JP fuel, the ordinary fuel we use like in an airline airplane, and hydrogen, raw hydrogen. And the hydrogen tank only had half enough. So when it ran out, the plane came down right halfway on the flight.
In the middle.
Yeah, predictable.
Right in the heart of the Soviet Union. But it's your position that Allen Dulles didn't know that they had put all this identification in there, or even that the flight was being run.
Well, I don't think I ever said I wrote that, because
no, you didn't write it.
There's no way to know. It appeared to me that the U-2 people were the most surprised people in the world to find out that plane is up there. The plane was sent by some other motivation, which was very limited, and got it in the air, because my office was across the hall from the U-2 people's office. And I provided support. And that morning when I came to work, their office was bedlam. And I wondered, what's the matter? And finally one of the guys said, we just lost the plane. If they lost the plane, they wouldn't have been all shook up. They would have known it was lost. They were shook up because they didn't know a plane was in the air. That's what bothered them. And another thing you should know about this kind of work is the office directly across from me was called Cover and Deception. Every time there's an operation, you have another office saying all the different ways that it couldn't possibly have happened. Like robbing a bank. You work out your cover story ahead of time. So you go rob the bank and you have your friend in Las Vegas saying, oh no, my friend was with me, we were in room 110, and we couldn't have possibly been robbing a bank. We were out in Las Vegas. You got to have your cover. But this is the way the government would work. It's either you two guys, my office, and the cover people, and we all supported each other. See, I provided the hydrogen, among other things. When I say I don't mean personally. I had a system, thousands of guys that did these things.
So it's a very small window or group of people who could have ordered that even in the air.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
It was there was something about somebody that was able to make the phone call that said go, and the guys in the field had no way to cross-check it, and the plane went. So there it was.
So could it have been? So it wasn't. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't this the event that stopped the summit meeting, right?
The summit conference, yeah. Oh, it very definitely was timed to the summit conference, because at that time, if you just look at the newspapers before May 1st of '60, you'll see that this coming summit conference was drawing columns by reputable writers that there was going to be a détente between the old war buddies, Khrushchev and Eisenhower, who during World War II were allies, and that they were sort of had the same desire for peace in the world and so on, and that this was going to be their last big deal. And
so it sounds to me like it's more of this high cabal kind of thing, not wanting there to be peace.
Exactly.
Essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And the timing is the clue,
right.
Because it's just like in Kennedy's assassination, the release of his plans for Vietnam, take all Americans out, cost him his life. That and the fact that he was definitely going to be reelected, so they would have no chance to recapitulate the things that he was ordering. So that's another thing that writers ought to be smart enough to do, is there is a very fine book, the Foreign Relations of the U.S. Volume 4, Vietnam, for the period August of '63 to December '63. It centers right in on those few months. And in it, it has, I think, 26 meetings in the White House by top people in the government on the Vietnam situation. They didn't bring in the Department of Commerce and all that stuff. talking about Kennedy's plan. They were developing Kennedy's plans right there with Kennedy. They named the people that were there every time. My boss was there at most of the meetings. When he wasn't there, he was out in Vietnam getting some information that they wanted, then came right back again.
Is that Krulak?
Krulak.
Yeah.
And all this is you can get on. I got it on a bookshelf upstairs. Anybody can walk in a government print office and get it. And there's Kennedy's plans for Vietnam that positively say take the 1,000 men out as a token by the end of the year. We'll have everybody out by 65, and I'm not sending anybody into Vietnam. That cost him his life.
As well as a lot of other people.
It's just like the U-2 affair cost Eisenhower the chance to talk to Khrushchev and probably reach a détente. That's what his goal was. He had, he had been working on Crusade for Peace.
Yeah,
He
right.
went to New Delhi, India. The biggest crowd ever assembled came to see him, and they planned to go to Moscow and have a bigger crowd there.
So what does somebody like Eisenhower do or think when that happens?
Oh, according,
Yeah,
and
Do you know what I mean?
he has written a book, or part of a book. I forget just where I have the thing, that where he mentions that. He mentioned that Powers wasn't shot down. Eisenhower does. And from that time on, he was, he had a lot of heart attacks, and he was a very weak person, very weak man. And Nixon was almost running the government. Whenever there'd be meetings, say, for the Cuban anti-Castro program, which had nothing to do with Bay of Pigs, when Eisenhower approved it, it would always be Nixon handling the meetings. Eisenhower wouldn't be there. His last year or so, he was just a figurehead.
But did he write anything then, saying what his opinion was of the whole thing?
I don't know whether it's his own writing or somebody writing him about it. I think maybe Emmett Hughes might have written it.
Mhm.
But it was to the fact that Eisenhower said the plane made one of its normal crash landings. He was using those words
Yeah.
as any military man would, because it isn't a conventional landing when the U-2 comes down. But he definitely is saying that the Russians didn't shoot it down. But the best source on that is Dulles himself in the same month, in the
Yeah,
May of
yeah.
'60, before the Foreign Relations Committee. Dulles says that in just plain words.
Our best judgment is that it did not happen as claimed by the Soviets. That is, we believe that it was not shot down at its operating altitude of around 70,000 feet by the Russians. We believe that it was initially forced down to a much lower altitude by some as yet undetermined mechanical malfunction. At that lower altitude, it was a sitting duck for Soviet defenses, whether fighter aircraft or ground-to-air fire or missiles. As to what happened at that lower altitude, we're not sure. The pilot may have bailed out at any time, or he may have crash-landed.
You say that Khrushchev gives him a way out after the discovery. First of all, Khrushchev announces that they've caught, that they shot down a plane. He doesn't say anything else, an American plane. And then Dulles provides a cover story, which is readily disproved by the Russians because they had a whole bunch more information than what they...
They said it was gathering weather information or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, NASA was doing all the publicity. The CIA was out of the picture. It was supposed to be a NASA airplane, upper weather atmospheric checks.
And he says, in your book it says, the Russian premier was ready to say, "We are so close to the summit and to peace. I am ready to accept that this was a cruel and terrible provocation made by others without the knowledge of the American president. Let the president stand up and say that he had no knowledge of this flight, and then back up his statement by firing Allen Dulles, Dick Bissell, and those other 4 men who had pressed so hard for this flight." So I'm curious who those 4 men were, and had Allen Dulles and Dick Bissell really pressed so hard for that flight?
Well, I think in their position, they couldn't, it was their U-2. I mean, their flight had been approved. But what you had to have read earlier in there, and I'm sure you did, was that the order for no overflights was non-exclusive. In other words, nobody was authorized. I grounded all the planes I was using to fly over Asia, and we were flying in those days all the way from Taiwan up to Kokonor and from from Thailand up to Tibet, and we were covering the area with a lot of airplanes. We just grounded them all. In fact, it probably cost us the Tibetan campaign because we were keeping the Kampas alive with food and medicine and weapons by dropping into their mountains all the time. We stopped, and they couldn't figure out what on earth had happened to us. Here we were supporting them and encouraging them to fight, and we stopped, which was a pretty bad thing to do. Well, all of a sudden, out of the clear, here comes a U-2 flight, which is an overflight. And just a short time before that, I had asked the Secretary of Defense to ask the White House for permission to fly over the Kampas with food and medicine. I said, we won't take any weapons, but the poor guys need this. And the White House turned it down. So I knew the White House was emphasizing the fact, no overflight. Then this flight took off. Well, ostensibly, it's a CIA flight. You have to figure, since the only person in CIA that could authorize it in the final analysis is Allen Dulles. But Allen Dulles wasn't talking. So he was, and when he did talk before the Foreign Relations Committee, he said clearly, he said it wasn't shot down. You know, in other words, Khrushchev is wrong. He's telling a lie. There's something else to it. And Allen Dulles was, and you can just read in the testimony how uncertain he was about the facts himself. So he was almost saying, you know, I didn't know about that, and I wasn't sure about this. He's almost saying, I didn't send that plane out. He didn't say it that way, but if you read the transcript carefully, you get that meaning out of it.
Now, is what you're telling us here now, and Dulles' possible uncertainty about this, is this something that you have come to since writing this book? Because this paragraph sounds like Dulles and Bissell pressed so hard for this flight and for other people.
What I'm talking about there is not the specific flight. What I was told when I found out that they made a flight that I thought was prohibited by Eisenhower, that they must have pressed for it. What alternative was there? Later, I got a hold of a copy of the transcript,
Okay.
and I could see what was bothering them. And see, these transcripts don't come out immediately.
Right.
You get the things later. And what I knew, well, from the U-2 contacts I had, was that it wasn't a normal flight. And this business of getting it to be flown at all, I knew had to have been done without Eisenhower's permission, because, well, I'll say White House permission, because that's the people who turned me down with the planes over Asia. There's no overflights.
The U-2 could reach 90,000 feet, much higher than Soviet MiGs or SA-2 missiles could reach. Allen Dulles briefed Colonel Andrew Goodpaster, who was Eisenhower's intermediary to the CIA. Allen Dulles stated that we were unlikely to lose a U-2, and if we did, the pilot would not survive. We were told, and it was part of an understanding of the situation, that it was almost certain that the plane would disintegrate, and that we could take it as a certainty that no pilot could survive. It's possible Gary Powers did not use the ejection seat because he may have wondered if it would have blown him up as well. The NSA reported Powers had been tracked down to 30,000 feet, and then when turning back to Sverdlovsk, was intercepted. Soviet fighter chatter revealed a pilot reporting, "He's turning! He's turning!" Soviet pilot Igor Menchikov reported in 1996 that he flew in front of the U-2 at around 30,000 feet as wash from his Su-9 broke one of Powers' wings, causing him to slowly circle to the ground. This had previously happened to a U-2 plane in September of 1958 in a mishap with a Canadian F-86 in West Germany. It has also been suggested that a Soviet mole was responsible for the malfunction. KGB officer Viktor Shmenov claimed that someone leaked the flight plan ahead of time. Colonel Prouty's view was that the sabotage was American by design, and one of the reasons for Eisenhower's distrust of the military complex. Fletcher Prouty never did reveal the names of those four men.
I have one other thing, because all of this ties into the Hanukkah ball thing. It has to do, last night we were trying to put together the scene that you write about at the very end of JFK. And in one of your letters of correspondence with Len asks, let's see, it had to do with the Gold Key Club. And
Can I ask one question?
Mhm.
Gold room in the Pentagon. I didn't know there was a gold room there. Is that where the
Oh,
Gold Key Club comes from?
No. They just.
Oh, okay.
The gold room is where the JCS meet.
Yeah.
It's just always been the gold room.
Oh.
It's a sort of a luxury room when you know what the Pentagon looks like somebody's coal cellar, but that room is a little bit better.
Yeah.
Pretty
Okay.
big coal cellar.
And Len had asked, when you first start thinking about the high cabal or the super elite or whatever, and try to figure it out, I think that's where this question came from. He was asking about Curtis LeMay and George Anderson and Ed Lansdale as possible members, and you write back, they're not 1/10 the way up the scale to play the role that I describe in the book. The people that Winston Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin look up to, and you go on a little bit like that. So with that answer and looking back into the book, we were trying to put together an understanding, and I just want to read this one paragraph and then ask a question. The paragraph is, it's the part of the book where you say, imagine a group, let's see, you can easily visualize a businessman's club in downtown Washington, New York, London, etc. A group of senior members have gathered for lunch or a third martini, and they get talking about Kennedy, and eventually goes, I tell you that Kennedy has got to go.
Mm-hmm.
This is the paragraph that I'm concerned with. On the perimeter of that intense group sat a younger man, quietly attentive to every word and watching every move. Just then, as the speaker finished his words, he saw a wink in the eye of a senior member. He rose quietly and walked to a position behind his chair. That member turned and whispered a few words. They were all that he needed to hear. Quote, in the fall, somewhere in the South, find a way to get as many key people out of the city as possible. It's all up to you. There was the decision. Now, is this way off the mark, or would, if within the group, that group would hold like members of the super elite, the younger man on the perimeter of the group would be somebody further down the ladder who would understand the wink in the eye, and then when he gets his information in the fall somewhere in the South, it's all up to you, get as many key people out of the city as possible. And then just slightly later in the book, he says, he, the younger member on the perimeter, knew then that his biggest job would be to put a small cadre of the best men in the world at work right away on the cover story and on the deception plan. Is that younger member the man up the ladder from Ed Lansdale? Ed Lansdale.
No, they wouldn't have any relationship. Lansdale, from my point of view, was probably one of the key creators and motivators of the cover story. That's his specialty. He had done that all over the world. This fellow is almost like any office. There's some guy that has access to the president of the company to do confidential things, and he, as a result, knows how to do them. He knows who to call or things like that, and that's his role, no more, no less. Probably not even a lawyer, you know. They're just a guy that can handle things confidentially. As I see it here, I'm taking my clue, just like the movie did, beginning with the Eisenhower speech, from the Eisenhower speech as I close the book. And this is the military-industrial complex people, which is a pretty high group. And they aren't just military, the financiers and all the rest of it, that have reached a consensus. You know, it may have been 200 that talk in one time, another group here, and then they call each other on the phone. You know, by God, we were talking about it the other night in our club. You know, it's getting pretty bad. We can't have that son of a gun reelected. We've got to do something. And that atmosphere goes on, say from well, I think almost from the election, from the defeat of Nixon. The defeat of Nixon was one of the worst things that could have happened to the hierarchy in Washington, the president at that time. And then it carried through, and everything after that exacerbated that situation with the Vietnam War as one of the major things, but not by itself. So finally, a key group of these guys at the right time, they've just heard of this NSAM 263, which is going to shut the military off of $570 billion, and so that flips it. So they said, look, we can't stand this. So they call a guy, hey, get into the system, get going, and then turn him loose. And he knows what to do. It's like the mafia. Well, better way to explain it. Every state in the Union has people we call the hangman, okay? And they kill people, but they're not murderers. You know, we accept them day in and day out. They kill people as part of their job. It's a real nice job to have. You have to be a college graduate. But this is the way things are run. And I think things have been run probably that way for thousands of years. Because ultimately, just like the quote I had, was the king that said that the cardinal was getting in his way, and so he, I wonder who's going to rid me of that, you know, and then all of a sudden the cardinal's dead, the Cardinal de Beck.
Yeah.
Well, you see, all they're doing is referring to the same kind of an incident. The king didn't say, kill the guy. He just said, rid me of that pest. He's gone. Well, you can't, nobody, I'm sure, feels that those things are just one of a kind. That kind of thing had been going on. And so here there were, after all of what the book presents, here is a situation that boiled up to the point where this hardcore group sees this from their point of view as something they've just got to have removed. And I think I wrote one chapter under the title, The Kennedy Dynasty. You know, they weren't about to put up with the Kennedy Dynasty, beginning with old Joe, who bothered a lot of them anyway, without ever becoming president. And I think that's all it is. It's a technical story, not a hypothetical thing. It's a technical story. It's almost like coming up and finally in a court they say, this man is the murderer. Okay, go tell the hangman and get rid of him. It happens.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring it up is I was just trying to get an understanding of kind of the levels of power. And when I looked at it closely and we looked at the letter and we talked about it, we seemed to see a lot of levels. Whereas at one point I was looking at somebody like Lansdale and thinking, holy cow, this is where it all starts.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, frankly, I know an awful lot of what he used to do, and I know how he worked, but he wasn't on that level.
Yeah.
And the guy that makes the call isn't on that level. See, he's
right.
He's just a doer, gopher. No, it's a human elemental decision that at times congeals. I don't think you could say it even exists in any form day by day. But when there's a problem, when interest rates go too high, then somebody tells the Federal Reserve to move them down. Even the Federal Reserve is not superior, see. Well, that's this kind of thing. And it isn't mysterious, that's a fact of life. And in many ways it might not be an unfortunate one, because maybe they don't miss every time, maybe they get the right guy sometimes.
Well, the point about the different levels, or the point probably of our question, is that when we first heard and read your speaking, we thought, oh, Ed Lansdale, there's a picture of him. He's in Dealey Plaza. He's sitting around telling everybody, we're in control here, nobody worry. And everybody got out of town. And then you brought to our attention that he's only 1/10 up the scale, so we're looking up higher. Well, who would know what business he was in to call him? Maybe his boss. And that would have to be in the JCS.
Yeah, but his story.
And it happened. You're talking higher. You're talking economic people.
Well, he never worked for the JCS.
No, but who else would know of him though?
Well, his job was the cover story. So when he speaks to the men in the cover story, those actors that were the tramps and the actors and the police, he's only speaking to them.
No, but you see, he has a
the
specialized
idea who did the shooting.
No, but he wouldn't, like you say, have to or even maybe want to. right? And what I'm saying is that an economic council of people meet, they decide they're going to remove him. Like you said, that if it's a military action, down the line, they're going to have to call somebody in the military who then would call Ed Lansdale. Is that a correct? No?
Lansdale didn't work for the military.
Well, okay.
He was a civilian. In fact, he had retired.
Yeah,
before
November
Dallas,
31st or something, eh?
October.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Which is a kind of a signal. But he was a fictional military man.
Oh, I know what you mean by that, but he
Yeah.
was an intelligence, CIA. Didn't he work for Allen Dulles?
Yeah, he would be getting orders from CIA. But you can't, when it comes to, when the church committee tried to figure out whether this country had an assassination capability.
Mm-hmm.
Remember how involved that got? They got. In fact, Helms said we don't do it, and then he got put in jail for perjury because he couldn't explain himself. But
Well, yeah, they ran that MK Ultra.
the people get involved in that aren't necessarily Americans. In fact, I don't think they are Americans. It's just like the pilots I used to send over to the Soviet Union in the
U-2s?
U-28s, the L-28s. Most of them were foreigners. See, they're
British?
Pardon?
British?
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
No, we wouldn't use our buddies. No, they're just plain foreigners.
Okay.
From any source. For instance, one of the best
Polish.
sources in those deals were ex-Polish refugees who had been pilots in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
We pick them up in Maine where we had a training base, and we train them.
You tell them really.
That's what I mean about there's no sovereignty in these things. You have to forget sovereignty when you're doing in this kind of work.
Yeah. But back to this level of how far up do you look when you talk about TV Sung
Well,
and
it's
some of
like
those guys?
smoke. One day the level goes this way, and another day there is no firm. At least my concept now. Of course,
Okay,
that's all
sure.
I can describe.
No, it's worth hearing.
Yeah. On another day, I couldn't imagine who John Foster Dulles might call in another problem. You wouldn't call the same guy, probably, see?
Mm-hmm.
So he has phones scattered around his house.
Well,
with no miles.
not use the same phone, but the first thing he called would be different. I think that the top group is so far removed from the daily work. They don't run General Motors, and they don't tell General Motors what to do, and they don't tell the Toshiba Works what to do, or they don't tell Deutsche Bank what to do. Although somebody just shot the president of Deutsche Bank,
Yeah.
which is as bad a murder as Kennedy's murder, more influential. Well, these things happen. And they don't even have trials. Whoever does it can stop the court system from working. That's a pretty big thing. And try to picture how that's done.
Yeah, it's just hard to picture that, to sit back and go,
Who
how?
told Lyndon Johnson to have his first meeting with the Attorney General of the state of Texas? Said, Lyndon, as soon as you get back into office after they get the ceremonies of burying Kennedy, the first guy you talk to is the Attorney General of Texas. You tell him we're not having any trial down there in Texas. And that's the first meeting. Who told Lyndon Johnson that very first day? See, it's all that kind of stuff.
Well, those kind of people aren't just regular civilians then. They have to have something to do with that military complex.
Yeah, but they don't come from the ordinary civilian channels.
Okay, let's
They couldn't
say like
possibly do it because it
Right.
would leave a trail otherwise.
So anyone who gets into any kind of political power knows that they're going to have to answer to this higher level.
Yeah,
I mean,
political
with
power
like
today.
point blank to any
that's
any
right.
point, right?
Political power is for you and me.
Right.
He's a guy we can blame for something we don't
Right.
care about. But the poor guy hadn't much to say about it.
Right. And when do you think that kicks in? I mean, does it kick in when you're a state legislator? Do you know about it then? Is it when you become a congressman for the first time? Is it when you become a senator? Like, when do you think it kicks in? Do you know what I
Very
mean?
good question. Among the jobs I had in the Pentagon, since they would only permit one person. I was called a focal point officer. The CIA didn't want to brief a whole bunch of people, so I got one guy. I had to go, as a function of that work, to the Senate, and there were 4 senators I could talk to. That's all. They had been cleared to be spoken to. Now, they didn't know who the hell told me what I was telling them, but they know that when I came in the door, that's why I was there. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in their room. But you know what I found out they would do? I'd walk in and see one of them who happened just by a strange coincidence to be acquainted with my father. Why, Prouty, glad I was thinking of your dad this morning. How's he doing? And all that. Now I'd say, look, General Martin said, oh, how's your dad's golf game? Now General Martin sent me, oh, is he doing all right now? Well, thank you. Hey, listen, by the way, whatever General Martin approves, I approve. Go ahead, Prouty, get the hell out of here. They wouldn't listen to me. And I was there to tell them, those senators knew they had nothing to do with it. And that was personal contact with these guys, being sent there by the military, by the Pentagon. I was the only one that could have been sent, doing something that I was the only one the CIA could have been told. And that's why I couldn't quit. I went to Hawaii, sat at a desk, new job in Hawaii after I'd had that job for 4 years. The first paper they brought to me was a wire from Washington, come on back, you got to take your old job back. And they kept me there another 5 years. Well, I could understand what the situation was, and I tried not ever to waffle at any. But one of the best examples of this question is that you couldn't talk to the senators wouldn't listen. Another one was Senator, well, I won't name this senator.
You mean they didn't want to hear what you had to say?
They wouldn't listen.
They just didn't want to know.
After they got familiar with me, see, all they were telling me was, look, you can tell me what we know goddamn well we don't have anything to do with it. See,
Right.
That's what they were telling me. So why send you back to the Pentagon saying that you've just told 4 of us what's going on? Why don't you go back and say the door was shut and you couldn't tell us because it's going to happen anyway. See,
Right.
they could say so it's just a farce. And so I'd go to see them religiously. I'd get their secretary to sign a little note I had that I had been there. Like when you send a letter. When you send a registered mail, well, I got it signed. No, this is a different game. It is very hard to fabricate it. It didn't intend it to be fabricated.
In your personal experience, in the book you tell the story that we're so familiar with about, I think you're briefing Lemnitzer and Shoup, and they ask you how many of these CIA bases are being operated, and it's 605 at the time, and they're quite surprised at how many there are.
Yeah.
And you ask them, all of my time I've felt I was doing things on the orders, or I've been ordered by a superior officer and assumed that everybody knew along the chain of command what's going on. Now I'm talking to the senior military guy, and I find out that he doesn't know what was going on.
Yeah, I couldn't have told anybody but Len Osanic. He had a good sense of humor.
Yeah. Now, was this a pivotal moment in your life as well as in their life? Like, up until that point, if it's at that point where you realize, geez, there's another power center operating here over us all, but until that point, the power center is operating, but nobody knows it. It's just an accidental question that gets asked, and now you become very aware of it. Did you have any, I guess I'm interested in the internal feelings about, well then, if these guys don't seem to know about the ethical ends of things, like, did you ever did you reach a point where you doubted, whether or not everybody was doing the right thing?
Well, I wasn't, the job evolutionary. The longer you're in it, the more you begin to see it bloom, you see. Alan Dulles sent me around the world one time. I went to 42 of his chief people, the station chief in each country around the world. And it was very interesting. He should have given me a PhD when I got back. Because I would hear things replayed in 42 different ways by 42 different people, all of whom had a direct wire. Each station chief has a direct wire to Dulles. See, that's kind of interesting. And then when dealing with Lemnitzer, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dealing with men who are the Secretary of Defense, McElroy and Gates and McNamara. 3 completely different guys. So you couldn't figure any one of them would come off the same team. It isn't something you can buy by so much a pound. It's very ethereal, if I get my point across. And I finally realized that I was in a position of one of a kind, and that there'd be a lot of stuff I didn't know, but there was a lot I did know. And so I would size up the people I was talking to, because there's a lot they didn't want to know. You know, it would interfere with their work. It's like how often in talking about the Vietnam War, you never find anybody that seems to have stopped and said to himself, that couldn't have been a war. There never was a general in charge, which is true. Why don't people, we were in there for 30 years fighting a war that cost us 58,000 lives, and there never was a general in charge of our military guys. There was a general there, but he wasn't in charge. He'd have to turn around and ask some civilian what to do next. Well, that's important in warfare. My God, Clausewitz wrote a whole book about that. And other men, Frederick the Great and Gustavus Adolphus, the great guys. And you can't treat Kurt LeMay like that. I wrote recently to somebody that I thought Kurt LeMay was more like a college professor than this bombastic guy that he's pictured to be, and he is. I mean, I knew him pretty well, and he was a college professor type. He wasn't a great bomber pilot, except when a war's on, you have to play a different role. You're in charge, and if you aren't pretty strong, then you're not in charge. Well, I'm just amazed looking back at my own, I can't speak for anything but my own experiences, to find out how even important people are not aware of the things I was learning, because I was working in that environment every day, and they only saw me like once a month or something. And they didn't see anybody else in the CIA. You know, they didn't see anybody else in the military. By the law that set up this thing, it said will be done by a focal point officer. And then, by golly, instead of being the focal point for the Air Force, they made an office in the JCS. Now was the focal point for all of the services, which further, and it's just how things are set up. But it shows you how things are set up in other parts of, that was just the Pentagon, see, military. Just think what it means, like the Senate or the government of Texas or something like that. They get the word from somebody, from one guy. And that's the system, and that's what they mean, that it is an anonymous system, because anybody could knock me off and then nobody'd know where the guys were that were giving the orders in the first place. I never knew who they were a lot of time. I understood the code word and I would do what I was told. But you can't write a book about that. People wouldn't believe you in the first place.
And who takes those people's place? You know, like obviously people grow old and they pass on, and then who, is it like a hereditary kind of thing?
I'm sure it is. I'm sure heredity has an awful lot to do with it. And I think it's heredity that is, well, you know, if I had to describe like the Dalai Lama, I don't think it's as mysterious how they picked that child as they say it is, see? Because the Dalai Lama is almost always a mirror image of another one, you know. And I think that has loyalty has that kind of a thing. And the fact that our government has become, you know, more speeded up and everything has changed individual lives, but not necessarily theirs. We don't even know where they live. I went once to one country, and I was with Nullah's closest personal executive. And we went into the city, and as we went in, he said, "See that neighborhood down there?" "Oh, yeah." He said, "That's ours." And he said, "The people there are all specially trained for anything we ask them to do. They average 5 or 6 lives, you know, 5 or 6 passports. They could tell you that when they were 5 years old, they were in kindergarten in Buenos Aires. The teacher had jet black hair, dark eyes, and she was such and such. There was 18 kids in the class. They had memorized their lives perfectly for 5 or 6 lives. They could be sent on any job anywhere. They were Asians, they were Caucasians, and so on, because when they were needed, they were used for certain jobs. And the place was a resort. And I said, how the hell do you keep them in line? By God, they could write some pretty good books. If they did, they'd come home, there'd be no family, no kids, no nothing, you're fired. In fact, you would literally be fired with a gun. No break in the system. And I said, well, how the hell did that happen? He said, we just carry on what existed before. It's been the way of doing it. So that's pretty hard to take, but when you take it, when you're driving by the place and you're with Alan Bella's #1 man, I don't think he was imagining things. He wasn't that type of guy.
You guys want to take a little break?
Sure.
Or not? Or
Let's see.
I just wanted to get a glass of water then.
Yeah,
Sure.
turn it off one second.
I should have offered sooner. Just a minute, I'll get it for you.
You want to turn the camera on?
Matter of
Let's put these on pause.
putting it down here, I said. He was asked to do some very difficult job, like overthrow the government of the Philippines, practically by himself. I remember the first time
Pretty big
when I got to know you pretty well one day, I said, "How the heck did you do it?" He said, "With a checkbook." And that's a darn honest answer, you know.
Well, it's no easy. In general, that's if you're going to find out who did something or why they did it, it's like money, right?
Well, I think it comes down to that. But what he meant was he paid off enough people to get an establishment, and then the establishment. Another thing was they had never had what you call an honest election. So by getting McSisey, who was strong in the military by that time, I think by that time he'd made him the equivalent of Secretary of Defense. On election day, all of a sudden soldiers stood beside every ballot box, and they loaded the ballot boxes into trucks and hauled them all into Manila, and in a public square counted them. And McSisey won hands down, see. Well, just an honest election elected the man. But it cost money to do those things, and Ed was writing the checks for all of the money for that sort of. And he was pretty honest about it. It didn't mean that the check did it alone. It meant he was able to hire people. And he used to make film, and he'd have projectors and go into these little towns where they'd never seen a movie picture and all that sort of stuff. And he'd find the biggest wall he could find. He'd show pictures where the people didn't know what to think of. I mean, seeing movies, you know, in their little town. And so he put all kinds of propaganda, psychological warfare stuff in the pictures, and these people had no defense against that. They'd never seen anything like that. And he used devices like that throughout the country. Like he created the hooks, you know, the opposition, the same thing we created the Cold War. You know, I flew, I can't remember whether I write this stuff or not, I flew into the Soviet Union in July of '44 because they were our allies. I came back to Cairo and got orders to go to Syria and meet a train coming in with POWs that we were getting out of the Balkans.
Right.
It was loaded with ex-Nazis that the OSS had put on the plane. And we were already siding with the Germans, who are our enemy, against the Soviets, who are our allies, creating the Cold War. And then before the war was over. So people don't get that stuff very often.
That's actually a question something that hooks into that. Although, can I just, before my tape ends, I want to ask the question I was going to ask in the kitchen, which was, we were asking you about how much you write and how much you talk about, and the assumption that you must know a lot more than what you're willing to write about. And you mentioned, and it's written here in the book, that you never had to sign the, well, the way they put it here is being the focal point officer. Not being a CIA man, he was exempt from taking the oath of secrecy. And people ask me all the time, well, how is it that you managed to survive? You're saying all this stuff, and why don't they kill you? And
Well, they should have added another clause in there that I was already Air Force top secret, and then I had the clearances above that that are pretty rare, and I wasn't going to talk on those anyway. But I felt they were much stronger, really, than the CIA's clearance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because you know, in the military, we don't look at the CIA as something up here. We look at something down there. The Defense Department is old and established, and in the beginning of my time with them, '54.
please stop.
I've got it here.
I know, but I gotta get it here.
Got it.
Okay, please continue.
Well, in the beginning of my time with the CIA, it was not the illustrious organization that it had been created since. If you think back that far, it was really just doing a lot of, you know, the U-2 hadn't been invented, and all that sort of stuff. CIA blossomed out really in the Korean War, we began to build forces up then, and with the creation of special forces, which a good bit of it was CIA. But that didn't impress the Defense Department. You know, hell, we were the top dogs and we knew it. So you had to feel that way, and that's why when they asked me to sign their clearance, I said, hell, I don't work for you guys. I got a clearance, good enough for the Defense Department, take it or leave it. And of course, that's the only way I could do it. I got Lansdale his general star. He was talking with me one day and about how the hell is he going to work his thing. I said, no problem. You know, and you probably know the story. I wrote the letter for Dulles to sign, and Kurt LeMay made him a general. Well, people would die if they knew that was the way it went.
Yeah, that's a funny story because I was just reading John Newman's book on JFK and Vietnam, and I'm only in chapter like 2.5 of that, and I'm coming across stories that I know involve you, but your name isn't mentioned in it.
Well, I exposed John as a mole back in Oliver Stone days. John is a terrific mole, but I told Stone, you be careful.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well, anybody working for NSA is, you know, they're working. They aren't out getting a PhD on their own. In fact, the first time he introduced himself to me was at the National Press Club, and he said he was a student working for a PhD in history, and he especially was Vietnam War, and would I tell him about NSAM 263? And I said, you mean you're in a doctorate level study and you're working on Vietnam and you don't know what NSAM 263 is? He said, no. I said, call me up someday and I'll talk with you. So forget the nice study it. Well, you know, right there he blew it farther. Then later I found out he was a major in the Army on active duty and intelligence. Then I found out where he lived. He lived in Odenton, Maryland, which is on the border contiguous to Fort Meade, where NSA is. Well, I didn't have to be too smart to put all that together, so I thought I'd better tell Stone pretty quick.
Now that's a fascinating story.
Well, he's doing his job.
Yeah.
There's a book up there. It was written in my office by a guy that was doing his job. Well, they wanted a desk and they put it in my office. The guy comes over there for about 6 months, writes a book, and the book gets published. And he all the time he wore a Colonel Air Force uniform. But that's a business.
Yeah.
But see what wherever your secret team book is in there, what the hell is that going to talk about?
You're talking about John Newman.
What? Yeah, I just slipped the subject there. I heard his toes going on. What are you doing?
Well, then I have a question
yeah,
on it. This fella Tom Clancy. This is a question from one of my friends. He says he was an insurance salesman. Have you read any of his books, sir?
Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that he knows quite a bit more than your average insurance salesman about the inner workings.
Well, you know, after his first book was done, which was done with the Navy, with the Naval Institute,
Right.
They had a lawsuit about who the book belonged to, because the Navy had just about written it for him, and they provide him all the information.
Would that be like The Hunt for Red October?
Yeah.
But the submarine?
No, the Red October. Yeah,
Right.
submarine book. And up to that time, see, the submarine information was classified. And of course, I don't know Clancy and I don't know the deal, but I was getting publications from the Navy Institute at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they felt that they retained the ownership, that they're the ones that gave them the information. Of course, he's a good writer anyway, but he's been front man, just like when I said that Howard Hunt wrote Alan Dulles' Craft of Intelligence. A lot of people don't know that, but it's public information.
So, you don't know him at all? You wouldn't have any opinion on him?
All I know is what I've read.
Okay. And, so you think he's having stuff presented to him to write? I mean, I guess the thing is that it seems like he's more than an insurance
He practically
salesman.
lived over there at Annapolis while they were providing him with, because all that inside information nobody would know. There was no way to know it.
Yeah.
In fact, people were saying when the book came out it should have been top secret.
Yeah, I
But
think some people came to visit.
They wanted the publicity to build up the submarine force. And they got damn good publicity from the book, and so the Navy got what it wanted. But then when he tried to take over ownership of the work, he had quite a lawsuit on his hand, but they more or less let him win the lawsuit. And then since then been building up other stuff he worked on. It's a method of doing it. It's just like I told you that this fellow that asked me to work on that Kennedy book with him had been paid ahead of time. Almost all of it. I couldn't tell you how many books within my own knowledge have been written that way by guys that just been paid to write the books.
Can you give us?
I mean, all you have to do is look at their background. Where the hell are they going to learn? Well, where can Clancy learn all that the stuff that only people underwater learned? When did he live underwater that long? All right, people ought to use their heads. You can't read it in a newspaper. You can't read it in a magazine. You can't find the information out anywhere. And all of a sudden, he writes an intimate book about being in submarines. Oh, come on. Well, here's this guy writing books about Vietnam, and he'd never even heard of, or he didn't know a damn thing about NSAM 263. Right away, I just told him, I said, look, I'm busy, I'm going to have to leave, but when you have studied that, I'll talk to you, because I'm one of the authors of 263, I'll talk with you. Then later I got a call from Oliver Stone. You know, have you been working with
John
Newman? I said, well, I'm not working with him because he had nothing going on. But there's an awful lot of that.
Can you give us the title of, say, a book on the Kennedy assassination that is available, that was you know for a fact was written like that? Like other than Case Closed?
I could do it easily, but I don't want to do it.
Okay.
No. I mean, if the guy wanted to do it that way, I mean, and
well, obviously Gerald Posner, right?
I would assume so. No, I can't. I've got his book. I haven't opened the cover yet. I don't know the guy. I have no right to talk about his book. Although he talks about me in the book, and what he says about me in the book is libelous. So really? I should take a shot at him. That's another thing that gets me is these guys that don't know what they're writing about say I don't know and that they do, and they never been there. You know, like going to Switzerland and didn't know there was mountains there.
Well, I've been there, and there are.
While we're on that topic, then I was going to ask you, what did you think of Nigel Turner's "The Men Who Killed Kennedy"?
I had nothing to do with it except that he came from my section of it, and I never saw the script, so I was quite surprised when I saw it that he had slipped over into the Mafia game because it cheapened it terribly. Mafia didn't kill Kennedy. And why he should have done so well with parts of the thing and got sold on that, I don't know. He ought to know better than that. But, you know, you don't know those people. In fact, he sent a young lady here about a year before he made the film to sort of work on a script, I guess, and what he was going to do. And then he came in here and took his pictures and left, and I had no idea what he was going to do with it. I never saw the whole script. So I was disappointed with it, really. It could have been a lot better. But it was good, but it could have been a lot better.
Yeah. It's one of the better ones, although the conclusions seem to go off.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly
good, and then you kind of wonder, well, how can you be showing shots of the Pentagon and this and that, and all of a sudden track down to this guy? And
yeah.
Although, okay, well, that's fair enough. I had just another question.
See, he was victim of a mole. See, those guys have a hell of a life. I know because I've had to try to help several of them, and they don't seem to realize how open they are to that kind of a inside operation. But the mole game is a pretty rich game.
Yeah, but you see, the thing is, if you're looking at this, I mean, if you want to learn, you're willing to pick up the book and read or watch the video or do whatever. And for instance, other than yourself, it's very hard to find a dissenting view on, well, is this guy a mole? Who would know? You'd have to read, like myself, an awful lot of books to decide this just isn't right.
Yeah, and when he's got like NSA behind him, he could give you three names, Jesus Christ, Mohammed, and so on, and call them and they'll swear I'm perfectly clean. I mean, in NSA, they make up that stuff. Just think of Copa over here getting millions of documents about Oswald. You think there were any 3 million documents about Oswald? That kid that worked at Atsugi? he was a good Marine, and he learned to take orders from him. But my word, to think that all these researchers have teamed up together to wait for all these documents that are going to be revealed.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, they're printing them like mad. They're trying to catch up with the demand for them.
Well, that's another question I have, but just back to here then. And this may or may not be just coincidence for myself, but the final episode of Oswald, in that, the Turners, Michael Turner's The Men Who Killed Kennedy, it's got Oswald's grave had been opened. Oswald's grave had been opened and his skull and or body had been removed. I don't know if you remember, they interviewed one of the morticians, guys who prepared the body, and he said he put it in there, and there was a big rumor that the body wasn't in fact in there, so a few years later they dug it up. And when they dug it up, they found out that the casket had been broken, and he remembered putting it in the ground, and he was there when they dug it up, so it means somebody else had dug it up, and when they dropped it in, it cracked on the bottom. And then he said that, well, he was sure that Oswald's body had an autopsy done where they had cut like the skull cap.
Look, Len, I don't read like the Simpson trial. I never saw one episode of it. Never.
Oh.
And I don't own it. That's the minute the word Oswald crops up, I shut my mind to it. It was a waste of time. If anybody believes Oswald had anything to do with the death of Kennedy,
no,
then he's all screwed up.
Well, that's not quite my question. I just was like, for instance, let's say they dug up Oswald's body and took it out. My question was, what could be behind that kind of thing?
Well, that's the cover story. They have to create a mystique about the name Oswald. And so they keep creating new things. Notice how many new things come up every year. Like Norman Mailer's book. I haven't read it yet, but from what I hear, it's just created like a Priscilla Johnson strip. I have read that. And on. They're creating this name Oswald.
So the more you talk about it, the more you're off track.
Sure, and then people think that there's something important about this guy. If they would just realize that it would be impossible for what they say he did for him to have done, and then drop it, everything would be better.
Yeah.
First of all, there's that oak tree standing between the window and the car, and nobody that is a professional shooter would shoot through a tree to hit a rabbit, let alone a man. And so on. I mean.
Oh yeah, I know all that. It seemed.
Well, then they should drop it.
It seemed sinister though.
Well,
that they would remove his head. Like for instance, what had happened was they took the skull, and when they took it out of there, it hadn't had an autopsy done on it. It was a complete skull. Yeah. And so then I'm thinking, well, what kind of business is behind that?
Well, that's the cover story. The cover story is the biggest story of the crime.
Yeah.
It's the old thing, you know. If you tell a lie, you got to tell a lie a long, long time. Crime, you do it just once, it's all over. But the cover story is perpetual. And this is what I've tried. Every time I lecture anywhere, I tell people that because you'd think sooner or later people would begin to realize that. Same thing a used car salesman tells you. Most people learn that.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And you kind of already answered this. So these moles live on anyway. I know when I read through the list of people who are going to be appearing at this COPA thing, a couple of names kind of piped up as people who 30 years ago were on the more sinister side, and now they're going to be out here speaking.
Sure.
As a featured speaker.
And some of the ones up there speaking are only there to meet some old friends that they want to meet. One of them just wrote me, call me on telephone. He said, I'm going to be in Washington, let's have lunch. I said, what the hell are you? He said, I got some old friends that are going to be there. They go for social ad. But, like I was there last year, but I wasn't on I only agreed with the judge that I would go the night before. And I went just to talk a few minutes because there were some guys there I hadn't seen for years. I wanted to see them. I didn't say anything. Not it's one of them. But I'm not going to be anywhere around them. I thought the whole thing would have collapsed then, but they kept it going for another year.
No, I mean, I'm even here now, but I'm not going to bother going because I looked through the whole itinerary and I thought, well, I've already heard that, and how many times can you say that? And I've heard this.
Well, see, it's if they could just get people to realize that there was a coup d'etat, and therefore these other things happened, it would clarify itself pretty quick. Living with a coup d'etat is a thought they don't want to think about. It's easier to play games with Oswald.
You
Well,
got it.
isn't that what the script says in the JFK film? Right? Don't concern yourself with the small parts of it. It's the bigger picture. It's the implications. Why?
See, that's what we were trying to do, and the way it
Something
was
came
written,
through.
we could only do it at the end when everything had been presented to show
Right.
how awkward it was to believe all that, and then say the few minutes at the end to say, now look, you better start thinking. Can't go any further than that.
That's just the way that we do it here with everything, though, don't you think? You know, we concern ourselves with these little piddly things, you know. So somebody slept with somebody, or somebody, you know,
Well-
stole from here or lied about that.
In the 70s, we thought we ran out of gas. I remember going to an official meeting run by a man that came from the White House. I was representing the railroad industry. And this guy that came from the White House to speak to those of us that were using a lot of petroleum, like railroad, airline were there, and all other big companies that contract for loads of petroleum every year were at this meeting. We were told by this man from the White House that the danger is arriving where by the year 2000, oil will be gone from this world. Now what are they saying? We've found so much in Russia that we've got to build new pipelines. They've found some more in Saudi Arabia. We've got to build. Oh my God! Oh, that's the way things work.
Yeah, it's my understanding they're not even listing the production in Russia.
They're what?
They're not, sorry, we're not broadcasting, but they're not making the amount of petroleum production
That Russia
available.
used to do. Yeah. Russia, they rarely ever publish this. Russia was producing 19 million barrels a day, and Saudi Arabia, anyway, in a certain fixed period of time, and Saudi Arabia was producing 5. The ratio was almost 4-to-1, and all the oil people knew that.
But the perception is that it only comes from the Middle East. We have to make it.
All I mean is that if they want to get the stories across, see, they can control them really, and the people will believe it. While the Japanese are working like hell to run their economy totally on hydrogen. The more SPI per, specific impulse in any element is in hydrogen. All you got to do is put a breeder on a beach, break the seawater into hydrogen, put it in pipes, call it natural gas, and go forever. Don't bother send any bills.
But there's no money in that, right? So.
Well, the government would run it. And they'd charge,
Right.
The government always
Right.
charges. They charge more than business does. They get right down to it. When I bought this house, I paid a certain monthly charge to buy the house. I pay more today simply for the tax on the house than I ever did in buying the house.
Wow.
Most people don't realize that because they buy a house and somebody else has paid the initial cost. But that's the way the government sells it. Well, I didn't mean to bring in all that stuff, but it does come out of the Oswald fiction, and it's too bad Turner got taken by some of it, because his intentions when I first talked to him were a lot different than what came out on the film. But I still think of the films I've seen, he did a pretty good one, and the one that came out later that was on A&E several times was a fairly good one. But
What about Walter Cronkite's version of how believable the single bullet theory is?
Yeah.
Did you ever have the misfortune of having to sit through that?
I don't know anything about that, but I can imagine what he might have been interested in talking about. I used to teach shooting on a rifle range for an armored division where we were firing so damn many bullets. And we had to do a lot of demonstrating. We had people that had never seen a gun before and everything, draftees and all. The bullets won't turn around, they won't turn circles, and they'll ricochet and everything, but you can shoot a bullet into a bag of water and it'll deform the bullet. Hitting the water, hit it with your hand and you feel water, and it'll deform a bullet. And have a bullet that's clean and it didn't through 2 people bouncing around in a car. It's just astounding that people believe it. And a lot of people do. Because if they didn't believe it, then it couldn't be Oswald, because 2 bullets aren't enough. Even Connolly tried to tell him that for half of his lifetime, and he finally quit. And Yarborough tried to tell him that from sitting right behind him. He said, I heard the damn bullet go over my head. I'm an old infantryman and I heard the damn thing. Well, I'm coming from
Well, you know that Connolly still had lead in his wrist and that. They wanted
and
to,
in his thigh.
when he passed away, they wanted to do an autopsy to take it out, and the family wouldn't let him. As soon as they pulled out one more piece of lead, they said, well, the sum is equal to the parts, and here we have more lead than's missing from the Okay, well, speaking about those books and moles and omissions and things, was there anything that your publisher left out of your book or asked you not to write about?
Not that. I think there were a couple of places where, but I don't remember anything. See, I had written that stuff in 1985, and it was published in 1985, 86, in monthly installments in a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never intended those installments to be consecutive. You know what I mean? So when I wrote the book, and the installments, the monthly installments of what Stone had read, because there was no book existing, but he read those 19 things,
Mm-hmm.
some of which, saying he was interested in Vietnam more than Kennedy. That's
Yeah.
what, when he started, that's, like the platoon and 4th of July and all that. And when he saw what I wrote about Vietnam, he went up and smoked it. That's what he talked more to me about than he did about Kennedy. And so what I had to do when they told me to write the book, they wouldn't even let me put my own title on. I wanted to call it Saigon Solution.
Mm-hmm.
I just took the 19 and tried to make them chronologically accurate. So I myself butchered it a bit while I was seeing. Stone had seen the other, so by the time the book came out, it wasn't the same thing Stone had seen either. So I can't tell you from memory, but as far as I know, what I wrote for the book is printed. I don't think they touched it. They didn't promote it. They didn't send a copy to a single newspaper in the country to get a review.
Really?
Not one newspaper. Usually when books come out, the first thing they do is send a truck out, and every newspaper gets a copy for book reviews. In fact, they get several copies, because I get a lot of books. A lot of these have been sent to me to review. That's how I got the copy. You get it in advance and everything. And I write a review, they publish the thing. But not one copy went. So I got very little help, except for the movie. The movie, gave it a boost.
Yeah, well, good. I mean, that's the one good thing of it.
Well, and
'Cause
that
like I
was
said-
plus and minus, because there was so much. Have you read the book of the film?
I have that. I haven't read it all. It was frightening.
It's the best publication on the subject of fantasy that I've ever seen out. And it also is the best background book for the Kennedy assassination lore, because it tells the things that they found in their research that were the best things, whether they were in the movie or not. And it's just, for instance, do you know that in the book of the film it says that they have receipt stubs from the Fort Worth hotel that Kennedy had stayed in on the 21st of November, that Lansdale had been in the Fort Worth hotel only a week earlier, and they have the receipt stubs from Lansdale's papers. Apparently he hadn't pulled them out of the papers. They're in the Stanford University Library archives. Things like that.
I
Things
heard that. Is it in that tape?
Yeah, you mentioned that in the video, but I misunderstood. Had the wrong book.
Yeah.
I was thinking you were referring to the book where they have collected the journalists' reviews.
Oh.
Well, that's
Of the
in there
movie.
too. Oh yeah.
Is that the same book?
Oh yeah, that's the same book.
I'm just reading, going, it makes you want to cry. They're
Yeah,
just
but there's,
savaging it.
There's also notes, and you have to read the whole book, because the way they did it, they'd write the script and then stop and insert a note, and then they keep going with the script and stop. And there's stuff in there that even with the research I've done, I've never even heard of it. There's really good stuff. Mars did it, and Sklar did it, and other people somehow put it, but I have never seen a book that reviews as accurately, both sides of the scale. They put the opposite down, then they put the other
So
side.
they put the true stuff and the folklore
Yeah, in the
stuff.
same book. And that's, I don't mind being called a son of a bitch by Gerald Ford if they'll let me put my words
Right.
in there with it, see?
Gerald Ford called you that?
Yeah, or worse, he said there's some colonel in the Air Force claims there was such a document as NSAM 263. There's no such document.
And when was this?
When he spoke at the press club. And I'm a member of the press club, and I wrote to the president, I said, I understand you're having this guy Bellin speak. I said, he's been libeling me ever since the movie. I can prove to you that everything he's saying, I said, I got military orders that say what I was doing, and he libels that. I don't want you letting him in the club. I'm a club member, and by God, I'm not going to sit in the audience and have you letting a guy up there. And you know what? The son of a bee who's from a newspaper let Bellin come up, and he and Jerry Ford together spoke there, and I was included in the things he jumped on. That's the power of the press these days.
Sure.
Hey,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I just want to clarify something, make sure I'm understanding it. This is another question about the power elite. You ask in a number of places, you're talking about the 500,000 man pack that was set for an invasion of Japan. It's called off, and then half of it goes to Korea, half of it goes to Haiphong. And you ask the rhetorical question, who ordered where these things were to go? And as a reader, you kind of answer the high cabal. And then as I was coming across these things, I was thinking, well, why the high cabal and not just some legitimate government body? And then last night I came across this paragraph that says, none of us were able to discover during these early McNamara sessions who had made that decision in 1944 or 45. It was an enormously important decision at the time, had monumental impact, etc. And is it because you can't find any documents where somebody orders this?
Yeah, that came out of the Tehran conference. The thing is, when I wrote that, like back in '85, I didn't have some of the information I got later. When T.B. Soong's people were there, they were making the plans for the decolonialization of Southeast Asia and realized that some of it might take fighting. So they were prepared for that. And when they sent General Gallagher down to Hanoi with Ho Chi Minh, they were sending arms from Okinawa, already on board ship to go to Haiphong Harbor, that were given to Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had no army, he had no weapons, he had no nothing. And all of a sudden, I better throw that little son of a gun out. What are you doing? He drools under his chin, and it gets a little bit itchy, and I haven't given him his little face wash. Hey, come on, let's go on outside. Come on, keep going. Attaboy.